Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and with me this week in the studio we have Spike's editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And joining us down the line we have a special treat, Spiked columnist and author of the forthcoming book Beyond Grievance, Rakib Ehsan.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Coming up on the show today, we'll be talking about the rail strikes, grooming gangs, the anniversary of Brexit, and trans activists' war on women. So this week, Britain has experienced some of the biggest rail strikes for 30 years. Workers with the RMT union are all on strike for a bigger pay rise and for job security. Tom, what have you made of this?
Well, I think the strikes are definitely worth supporting. I wrote a piece on Spike this week to that effect. I mean, a lot of these workers are 3 years into a pay freeze. They're looking to get, again, kind of some sort of guarantee that there won't be compulsory redundancies, which are being talked about under the auspices of modernisation on the railways. And I think this could be a flavour of things to come insofar as more and more people really struggling with this cost of living crisis and effectively being told that they've got to put up with a real terms pay cuts. In many situations where people have been struggling for quite a long time, there's obviously been a lot of discussion in the media this week. I think the attempts to kind of discredit these strikes and the RMT have gotten increasingly desperate. I mean, we've all heard the one about train drivers and how much they earn by this point, despite the fact that the RMT doesn't even represent that many train drivers. A lot of these people are making kind of money in the low 30s, and a lot of them are making a lot less than that. People are really struggling. I think it's revealed a lot. I mean, the strikes, there's the strikes themselves, and then there's been the reaction to it. I think whenever anything like comes up like this, I think it demonstrates just how sort of the right's kind of attachment to freedom and democracy only goes so far. Certainly when it means the right to strike. I also find a lot of this kind of discussion of all of these rail workers have just been kind of hoodwinked by these shady Marxist union barons, a quite interesting thing from a lot of people who were involved in the Brexit discussion and would push back on the idea that people didn't know what they were voting for. There's an overwhelming mandate for these strikes in that case. But then you've also got the kind of bourgeois left, who I can't have been the only person who was quite struck by the fact that they're quite selective in what form of working class power they appreciate. So if it's working class people agitating for better pay and working conditions, it's within that kind of trade union structure that they know and like, it's great, thumbs up, we'll show up at a picket line, all the rest of it. And yet if it's some of the very same people, given the fact that the RMT was a very staunchly pro-Brexit union agitating for Brexit, it's racist and terrifying and they want nothing to do with it. I mean, a lot of the kind of Corbynistas actually try to cancel a few RMT members over the course of the Brexit wars. So it showed up a lot of hypocrisies on all sides. But I think the underlying message of it, we can get too overexcited about what are significant. Part of the reason these strikes are so significant is because this kind of trade union action is often conspicuous by its absence these days.
It's incredibly rare.
But nevertheless, I think it is to be supported because, it's people not wanting to be pushed around in a situation where they are being expected to put up with less.
Yeah, I mean, Rakib, we're in this cost of living crisis. I mean, part of that is inflation, of course, but the other part of it is that wages have not been rising for actually a long time. Workers have had a raw deal lately, right?
Well, it's true, Fraser, that in the UK economy, wage growth has been largely unimpressive in recent times. I definitely agree with many of the points that Tom has made there. I think actually you've seen that undemocratic tendencies which do exist on the political right. There's a great deal of hypocrisy where they talk about the left being quite undemocratic, especially the liberal left. But I've seen people talk about banning the right to strike, which is quite remarkable. People talking for the fundamental weakening of trade unions. That's already taken place. Compared to other countries, our trade unions generally are nowhere near as strong. Especially in terms of their collective bargaining position. So I think that what this really exposes is that compared to countries such as Germany, which has that kind of co-deterministic model where you have a more cooperative economic culture between government, trade unions and businesses, in the UK, we still have a fairly confrontational and adversarial culture. And unfortunately, that means that in terms of our economy functioning accordingly and avoiding these kind of industrial disputes, it's very difficult to do that with that kind of culture being embedded.
Thinking about the confrontation, there's been some quite funny kind of confrontations with Mick Lynch has become a bit of a celebrity. Mick Lynch, the sort of head of the RMT, people have enjoyed his kind of set twos in the media. I mean, let's look at a little clip of some of those.
Some of your members will still stay on the picket lines. What will they do if agency workers try to cross those picket lines?
Well, we will picket them. What do you think we'll do? We run a picket line and we'll ask them not to go to work. Do you not know how a picket line works?
What if they do anyway?
Richard, you do come up with the most remarkable twaddle sometimes, I've got to say.
I didn't say you were a Marxist. I'm saying that you're
nonsense.
being accused of being a Marxist.
Let me show you what I believe is your Facebook page. I want you to confirm or deny if this is your Facebook page. It's a picture of the hood from Thunderbirds.
Can you see the likeness?
And actually, Mick, you don't know anything about my background or my community or where I come from. So
I can't even see you. I don't even know who you are. So there you go.
Tom, what have you made of that side of things? The journalists really being totally inadequate in the face of normal kind of trade unionists standing up for workers' rights.
I mean, he definitely made mincemeat of a lot of people. I mean, it was one of the things that actually I thought it was a bit of a regret. I think that some of the people from the kind of pro-Brexit trade union movement weren't more visible in that discussion. I mean, they were very marginal, even within the trade union movement, which more broadly is very bureaucratized, very pro-Remain, very middle class and kind of managerial in many respects. But there was this element who were, in many cases, some of the more powerful advocates for Brexit, and obviously evaded all of those kind of Tory caricatures. I think that was part of the reason that they were often kept out of that particular discussion. I thought it was interesting when Mick Lynch was on Robert Peston this week and Brexit came up very briefly and then they kind of moved on because it doesn't really suit the narrative. I suppose on the flip side, there's also been this aspect from not just the kind of bourgeois leftists, but even the sort of liberal left, who are kind of getting off on this kind of thing, which is kind of fascinating, despite the fact that in so many respects, they don't have much in common politically or otherwise with some of the people who are out on strike this week. So it has become a kind of media spectacle to a certain extent, but you can't help but take some delight in the way he was kind of cutting through a lot of these supposedly very esteemed political journalists like a hot knife through butter. That was quite enjoyable. I think it's interesting, because a lot of the attack lines they try to throw at them, and there's a lot of talk recently about the sort of return of the 1970s. We've touched on this a little bit here, insofar as the people making that accusation in order to try and demonise the strikes, you just wonder what planet they're on. We live in a fundamentally different time now. I think it was for every 100 days lost to strike action in 1979, it's like 1 day is the equivalent in 2019, which is last year that they had numbers for. Trade union membership has plunged. And so this attempt to try and, often on the part of Tories, kind of pose as these mini Thatchers, it's just a way of kind of getting their rocks off rather than actually dealing with the situation as it presents itself. But I think then on the other side, there is this kind of people getting a bit ahead of themselves on the left, as if to say that, this is some great high watermark and all the rest of it, when, as we were talking about earlier, this kind of action, certainly this firm and this committed, is broadly speaking quite conspicuous by its absence these days. And I think a lot of the kind of competing use of that 1970s metaphor shows that up in many respects.
And Rakib, what have you made of the kind of reaction from the main parties? I mean, we have the Tories who, earlier this year were promising us a high wage economy, who are suddenly turning on these strikes. And then we have Labour, who seem to be completely on the fence over this, quite important industrial action. What have you made of that?
Well, I think one thing that I would mention is the fact that the Conservative Party coalition is very different to the conventional one after the 2019 UK general election. There are more Tory voting trade unionists, largely because of that Brexit realignment after the 2019 general election. So I do think the Conservatives, they need to think in a more considered manner in terms of how it approaches industrial disputes. I have to say, I think that in the Labour Party, once again, a great deal of confusion from the Labour Parliamentary Party in terms of how to approach these rail strikes. Just like on a host of issues, there is a fundamental lack of clarity. Just moving on in terms of looking at Mick Lynch's performances in the media, I think he's been absolutely brilliant. I think he's ran rings around various journalists and presenters who've been woefully out of their depth. I think parts of our media have been out of their depth. I've seen the slogan "Labour isn't working," Labour hasn't been in power since 2010. So the reality of the matter is the Conservative Party has to take a degree of responsibility, because I think that one of the primary responsibilities of any government is to maintain somewhat of a healthy relationship with influential and strategically important trade unions in order to ensure that these kind of disputes are avoided.
And just to tack onto that, I think, and you gestured to it there, Rakib, but Labour's response to this, I mean, this is what you always get from the Labour Party. Yeah. I think it's worth saying, they never miss an opportunity not to get behind a strike. And I think in recent years as well, because the party's become so middle class, it's become so paternalistic, it doesn't really know what to do with genuine expressions of working class power. It kind of reacts to them, comes out in hives. And of course, you've got Keir Starmer, who is chasing whatever he believes to be the median voter. It's not entirely clear who that person is. Someone who both wants to stand in front of the union flag and take the knee. I don't really know what it is that he wants to carve out here. So they've just been completely sort of bamboozled by it. And at the same time, as you say, there is also that again, dreadful response on the right of politics, which is to try and undermine these rights, as Rakib was talking about. That talk about bringing in agency workers to break strikes, and more significantly, in some respects, this idea that you have to maintain some kind of minimum service. So again, people who like to talk about the state not butting in too much in relation to how people organise and how people's kind of freedom of association and allowing people to, again, kind of fight for themselves. There's a bit of hypocrisy there, certainly.
There's so much I want to do this summer, and with the sun finally shining in the UK, I decided now would be the perfect time to get my camera out. To take the best pictures possible, I've started learning with the Wondrium series, Fundamentals of Photography. I can't recommend it enough. You're guided through the series by a wonderful teacher, National Geographic photographer Joel Sartore. After 24 detailed and fun episodes, he not only explains the concepts behind composing that perfect shot, he also demonstrates how to actually do it with some incredible eye-catching examples. It's definitely encouraged me to try and be a bit more adventurous with my shots. So why don't you try it yourself on Wondrium? Wondrium is the subscription video service with content on just about any topic you can think of. With Wondrium, you can explore audio and video courses on hundreds of topics taught by university professors. There are documentaries to help you learn more about the world around you. And you'll find video tutorials that teach you new skills like cooking, learning a language, and more. All of Wondrium's content is world-class and credible. It's presented by experts who all know their stuff. I want you to sign up for Wondrium today. Wondrium is offering Spiked podcast listeners a free trial plus 20% off the annual plan. To get this offer, you need to visit wondrium.com/spiked. Again, that's wondrium.com/spiked. Sign up today. So this week we've had another horrific report about grooming gangs, this time around Greater Manchester. I mean, one of the details that has come out is that a notorious grooming gang leader was in fact an employee at Oldham Council, which is just completely shocking. Once again, we kind of hear about these kind of institutional failures of the police, of local authorities to essentially protect young women, young people in general from, avoidable crime. I mean, Rakib, could you set out a little bit for us what's different about this report, or what's new that we've learned? Because this is obviously, this scandal has been going on for years now and has affected, young people in all kinds of towns across the country.
Well, Fraser, much of it is an all too familiar story, if truth be told. One of the reports that was published this week was an independent assurance review up in Oldham. And as you said, one of the most remarkable stories detailed in this new report was the fact that you had a grooming gang ringleader employed by Oldham Council as a welfare rights officer, which is absolutely remarkable. And the police, Greater Manchester Police, failed to inform his employers about his past, which included being arrested for child sexual assault, which is just absolutely astonishing. And the report found more generally that up in Oldham, the kind of multi-agency structures that were in place to maximise child protection, especially those who are at risk, vulnerable young people at risk of child sexual exploitation and abuse, that those systems had fundamentally failed. So in that sense, it is an all too familiar story. There was also a new report out in regards to Rotherham in South Yorkshire. Similar findings in terms of police officers. It finds that police officers were not well equipped to cope with the widespread child sexual abuse that was taking place in the town over a period of 15 years. But this is a story that can be told in many parts of the country. But what I would say personally is that what it really shows is that destructive combination of political correctness and identity politics combined with those victim blaming tendencies among irresponsible public officials. As a result of that, the most vulnerable in society, especially young white girls who are from dysfunctional family backgrounds, history of parental neglect, relatively isolated in the care system, they've been severely let down, Fraser.
Yeah. And just to pick up on that kind of identity politics point, Tom, I mean, it seems that time and time again, it's a case of we've got the wrong kind of perpetrator. People don't want to be accused of racism by suggesting that some of these men might be doing what they're doing, and the wrong kind of victim with white working class girls, as you suggest, Rakib. Not a kind of fashionable identity group to be looking out for.
Well, it is amazing. I mean, as you've both alluded to here, is that effectively political correctness in not just this case of Oldham or in the case of any of these individuals, but all of them across the board. We're talking about Rochdale, Rotherham, Oxford, Huddersfield, Telford. The list goes on and on and on. These kind of individual chapters in this growing, grim story. Time and again, political correctness is basically put ahead of protecting the most vulnerable people imaginable in society. Young, working class, poor girls, often in and out of care, wards of the state much of the time, who have often tried to take as many opportunities as they can to actually, report these things to police. There was that one striking finding, I believe, in the Oldham report, Rakib, do correct me if I'm wrong, of a 12-year-old girl called Sophie, in quote marks, who goes to the police station having just been raped and is basically told to come back when she sobers up.
God.
I mean, this sort of thing is dreadful. And we all know that the inertia around this issue is because of the fact that, statistically speaking, the grooming gang phenomenon is by and large Pakistani Muslim men. And for a very long time, that has terrified the police authorities and politicians in terms of even talking about this, let alone investigating it properly. You see there was a previous report about Greater Manchester talking about the fear of inflaming racial tensions by tackling this issue head on. And also there's the fear of accusations of racism, which have been levelled against any of the MPs who've tried to raise this issue. Sarah Champion is probably the most recent example, but there are others just hounded out really of frontline politics if they try and raise this particular issue. And it's dreadful on so many different levels. As you say, are we going to have a hierarchy of victims in this particular way, or a hierarchy of perpetrators? Is a crime less serious, even one as heinous and as evil as this, because of the potential kind of optics consequences of investigating it? And similarly for the victims, does it count less? And you do think about how in recent years, say something like the Me Too movement or the Pestminster scandal would dominate the news for months, weeks, all the rest of it. Some of it serious allegations, a lot of it not often. It's cases of kind of clumsy comments and a hand on a knee at a Westminster event or whatever. That is a big, conversation, soul searching. How are we going to sort out our culture? And yet this grooming gang scandal rumbles on, year on, and it makes almost no impact on the discussion more broadly. People talk about it, but then they kind of move on very quickly. And that's morally obscene. And I just do not know how we can pull back from that, really. Because again, there's another review, there are lessons learned. I'm sure things are implemented on the local level. But as a society, more broadly, and as a polity, we don't talk about this stuff properly. And as this report has demonstrated, we desperately need to.
And Rakib, I mean, race relations is often given as the reason why we shouldn't talk about these things or why things are not followed up. I mean, doesn't that just make things a million times worse to cover them up rather than to deal with them head on, deal with them like you would do any other crime?
No, it's absolutely remarkable. I think one particular operation that springs to mind is Operation Augusta up in Greater Manchester, which was prematurely closed down by Greater Manchester Police with the support of Manchester City Council. This was looking at group-based child sexual abuse and exploitation taking place in Greater Manchester. In terms of the victims, largely vulnerable white working class girls. In terms of the suspects, men of predominantly Pakistani Muslim origin. Police officers were wary of looking like they were targeting a minority group because they'd previously dealt with cases involving men in the Kurdish origin local population. And in this case, much of the focus was on men of Pakistani heritage. And they ultimately failed in their duties and were incredibly reluctant to pursue these investigations because they didn't want to look like that they were being racist, or that they didn't want to look like they were targeting another ethnic minority group. And it will really have to make this point that these public institutions, public sector workers, their primary responsibility is to maximize the protection and welfare of those who are most vulnerable in society. But that's a classic case where the safety of the most vulnerable is being sacrificed on the altar of multicultural ideology.
And Fraser, just pick up on that point you're making about making it worse, because I think
doesn't it inflame?
Yeah, well, this is the thing, because I'm old enough to remember when the grooming gangs phenomenon was a far right myth. Right?
Yeah.
I remember every so often, you would have a genuine far right bigot would find themselves on Newsnight or something like that. Talked about.
Even Tommy Robinson was talking about it on Newsnight.
Exactly, they don't often appear anymore. Partly because support for the far right, to the extent that it did exist, has sort of collapsed in recent years, but also because it seems to be more of a cordon sanitaire these days, for good or for ill. But they would often talk about this stuff and it would be basically dismissed out of hand. The reason I raise this is not to say that those people were vindicated in any meaningful sense. The problem is the failure to talk about that means that the individuals who are willing to talk about that, in many cases bad actors who genuinely want to use this to stir up, racial strife and hatred and all the rest of it, will be the only ones talking about it. This is a common story you see in terms of radicalisation, far-right radicalisation amongst white working class boys in the North, is this particular issue. So we've got it completely the wrong way around. If you want to create a situation in which this discrete but very difficult and unpleasant issue needs to be dealt with, you need to deal with it. Otherwise, you do create a situation in which it will be used to smear all Muslims or all Pakistani men, or be used to genuinely try and divide up society. It's the failure to deal with it that risks inflaming tensions, not dealing with it, which is what they should have done in the first place.
Absolutely. And Rakib, do you want to add anything finally?
I agree with Tom. I think that the way these cases of group-based child sexual exploitation have been fundamentally mismanaged, it's a gift for the far right, if I'm being completely honest. It emboldens the far right. The problem is that the left, I was raised and live in a predominantly working class Labour voting town. I was raised thinking that left-wing politics was all about protecting the most vulnerable in society. But I think the problem is that many people on the left don't want to engage with this issue because it fundamentally undercuts their white privilege narratives.
If you're a fan of the Spike podcast, you'll have heard me talk about how important it is to have a VPN to protect your online privacy. But choosing a VPN you trust is equally as important. Now, I always do a lot of research into our sponsors, and I only ever recommend brands to Spike listeners that I believe in. I can say with full confidence that ExpressVPN is the best VPN on the market, and here's why. Number one, ExpressVPN doesn't log your activity online. Lots of cheap or free VPNs make money by selling your data to advertisers, but ExpressVPN doesn't do this. They've even developed a technology called Trusted Server that makes their VPN servers incapable of storing any data at all. Number two, speed. ExpressVPN now uses Lightway, a new VPN protocol they've engineered to make user speeds faster than ever. I've tried loads of VPNs in the past and they can sometimes slow my connection, but ExpressVPN is always blazing fast and it lets me stream videos in HD quality with zero buffering. The last thing that really sets ExpressVPN apart is how easy it is to use. You don't need any technical skills to get set up. Just fire up the app and tap one button to connect. That's it. Even your grandparents could do it. And it's not just me saying this. Business Insider, The Verge, and many other tech journals rate ExpressVPN the #1 VPN in the world. So protect yourself with the VPN I use and trust. Use our link, expressvpn.com/spiked today, and you'll get an extra 3 months for free on a 1-year package. That's expressvpn.com/spiked. Visit expressvpn.com/spiked to learn more. So this week is the 6th anniversary of Brexit. In fact, today, on the day we're recording this, Tom, Spiked has always thought of Brexit as something to celebrate. Do you want to explain why?
Well, it does feel like it does need to be explained. God almighty. I just tweeted earlier about why Happy Brexit Day.
Name one benefit. Name one benefit.
Well, I've been bombarded by about 300 Remainers asking me, name me one single benefit. That's a funny tick. But that's kind of indicative. I wrote about this on Spike this week. I mean, it's the 6th anniversary. It's not a round number or anything. But I think the reason it's worth talking about is because it's so striking how uncelebrated Brexit is. I think, Spike think, I'm sure many more Brexiteers think, it was genuinely one of the most positive things that's happened in British politics, certainly in my lifetime, probably for a good period before that as well. It was a genuine blow for democracy. You've got to think back, you had the entire political media elite, the capitalist class, the lovies, everyone was, preaching fire and brimstone as this happened.
Barack Obama
was flown in, all that stuff. And yet British people, supposedly quite a conservative and risk-averse bunch, said, no, actually, we want more democracy, we want more control, we want to bring politics back home. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that it's another kind of great step towards the democratisation of Britain in the kind of lineage of the Levellers and the Chartists and the suffragettes. It's a really important thing. And yet, the narrative that we have is that it was this horrendous mistake whipped up by xenophobes and indulged, unfortunately, by idiots. That's kind of what's happened. And I think it's just really important that we do sort of mark it and celebrate. We're in a really bizarre situation in which history, in this case, very recent history, has been written by the losers.
Yeah.
They still really have control over the narrative, and their narrative is that it was basically like a mini 1930s, which desperately needs to be reversed at the nearest opportunity. So I think that's something which just needs to be said, which is, for all of this discussion, name me one benefit of Brexit. I mean, Remainers often say that after you've probably listed several benefits. It's just a kind of rhetorical question that never actually ends. And while they start talking to you about how they've lost their mobile roaming data or something like that, I mean, it's ultimately quite ridiculous. I stood in a
long queue at the airport
once or whatever. But the Brexit is a benefit in itself, in as far as it's about democracy. It's not about immigration. It's not about the economy. It's not about roaming charges. It's not about forcing Apple to make a different type of charger, as is now being discussed in the European Union, and some people are celebrating. It's about control, and it's about being able to decide, and it's about having a proper choice at an election, because the politicians you elect can actually do stuff far beyond the remit that they were able to previously. So I think in the face of all of that, Brexit is still very much worth celebrating. It was a great moment, and we really shouldn't let it be sort of libelled or forgotten, which I think we could easily be at risk of doing.
Definitely. And Rakib, I mean, one of the big themes of the Remainers was that Brexit was racist, and voting for Brexit was going to unleash this torrent of vile kind of Nazism. There's going to be pogroms, and ethnic minorities are going to be chased out of the country. What's the truth? What's really happened since we voted leave and since we left?
Well, I think that we've seen the likes of David Lammy compare, for example, the pro-Brexit European Research Group in the Conservative Party with Nazi Germany and apartheid South Africa. That's how ridiculous it has been. Some of the commentary has been people describing a democratic exercise as some kind of fascist coup, which is absolutely remarkable. The reality of the matter is, when you look at the kind of places that voted Brexit, my hometown of Luton, which is incredibly super diverse in ethnic and religious sense, voted leave, 56.5%. People are still amazed when I tell them Slough voted leave. Slough voted leave, Bradford voted leave, so did Hillingdon. And there's one ward in Hounslow called Osterley and Spring Grove. People, if they are familiar with it, they'll know that has a very notable Indian origin presence, relatively affluent as well, a high rate of home ownership. Delivered a leave vote above 60%. The reality of the matter is, Brexit was actually not only a cross-class enterprise, it was also a multi-ethnic one. As well. So this idea about this being an indication of the degree of white nostalgia in the UK, which I think that was something that Sir Vince Cable suggested that was a possibility, just complete and utter nonsense. I think what you'll see with the people who voted Brexit, there's that shared desire for the restoration of national sovereignty. Many wanted a higher degree of fairness within our immigration system. They felt that EU migrants were the beneficiaries of preferential treatment under freedom of movement. They felt that wasn't particularly fair on migrants from Commonwealth countries outside of the European Union. So there's various factors at play. So I felt that much of the pro-Remain establishment, especially in politics and media, they just wanted to reduce this as some kind of racist, bigoted provincial enterprise. When you actually saw that a number of cities which are multi-ethnic actually voted for Brexit. So I found that the moment that the result was delivered, and up to now, much of the commentary continues to be of a particularly low quality.
It's all the immigration picture as well.
Yeah.
Is, far different from the kind of xenophobic hermit kingdom we were supposed to become after Brexit. I know you've written about how in the past year in particular, I think the immigration numbers and the composition of who are being able to work in the UK has changed. You want to say a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you actually look at the sort of inward migration composition, how that's changed in the post-Brexit setting, we're now seeing more migrants come from Commonwealth countries such as India, Nigeria, Pakistan. So I think what you see there is that under the sort of post-Brexit skills-based immigration system, we actually have a relatively we still have a relatively open immigration system. It's just that it is more well ordered in my view, and I think it's a fairer system because irrespective of which continent you live on, people are being subjected to the same assessments and procedures. So I do feel that contrary to people saying that Brexit, this is all about pulling the drawbridge, becoming a relatively isolated, insular island, that is simply not the case. Within that kind of Brexit electorate, you could say there are some people who are relatively protectionist, but then you also have people who are the more kind of, you could say that sort of outward-looking global Britain pro-Brexit internationalists. But of course, if you talk about all these various sub-electorates, much of our pro-Remain commentary are not remotely interested in that level of detail at all.
One thing that's worth remembering is, at least for the response to Brexit from the Remain establishment, from the political class, and all the rest of it, it was never really about the European Union. Yeah. I'm sure many of us have had this experience where you get talking to someone about the European Union and it becomes, who are very passionately anti-Brexit, and it becomes very clear they don't know very much about the European Union whatsoever. I think
for the high information voters.
Exactly. For these people who are so much smarter than the people of provincial Britain who have voted for this thing. They don't know any of it. And there's a reason for that, is because this was always for them a proxy, really. They were horrified by Brexit because the oiks had acted out of line. All of those attitudes, which we all knew were there, but have become very politically incorrect in a sense to mention in polite society, that effectively most people in Britain are idiots and that they're scum and that they're kind of racist, or at least they have these tendencies and they shouldn't have those tendencies ever kind of pricked or massaged at any point because otherwise all hell will break loose. All of that became bursting out into the open. The reason they hate Brexit is not because they love the European Union, it's because they're really uncomfortable with democracy. Yeah. And that's been one of the great things about Brexit. It's really clarified where those battle lines are. And whilst I think there's still a lot of work to do in relation to properly democratising Britain, taking that spirit and making sure that it is pushed even further, I think in and of itself, knowing that, I think has been a great boon in many respects.
And finally, on Sunday, when women's rights activists went to protest in Bristol, they were greeted by some kind of anarchist types, I guess you could say, in black masks, screaming at them, screaming misogynistic obscenities. And this has become a kind of depressingly familiar trope now. Let's have a look at a clip from this most recent demo.
You can literally just attack our kids. Yeah? Go home, get in the sea, die out. You're dinosaurs, fossils. Yeah? You're gonna die out.
Some brave young men there trying to menace middle-aged women in the round. I mean, it's incredible.
Tell me what is wrong with these people.
This happens. This happens time and time again. I mean, this particular kind of anarchist, anti-fascist lot, effectively, who have shown up at a couple of these big gender-critical demonstrations. I mean, this was, I think, it was an event called Let Women Speak, organised in Bristol, and these blokes show up. It similarly happened in Manchester recently, where the same group of feminists or a similar group of feminists were trying to give a speech around Emmeline Pankhurst's statue. And these Black Pampers, as they've been dubbed on Spike this week, not entirely sure what that means, but I find it funny, tried to get in the way. I mean, you have this spectacle of people who claim to be on the right side of history, who claim to be the Be Kind Brigade, effectively, dressed head to toe in black, shouting obscenities, often sexualized insults and kind of like, veiled rape threats, effectively, at women who are trying to organize around women's rights, and claiming that they're on the right side of history, claiming that the other side are dinosaurs, as you heard in that particular...
And they're going to die out.
And they're going to die out. This escalated to the point where a lot of the feminists who were there ended up being essentially barricaded inside a pub by police because they wouldn't go away. And I think this is not... There is something about this which I think is very, very telling, which is to say there is a strain of deep misogyny and authoritarianism within the sort of trans rights movement, quote unquote. It increasingly takes this particular form and can often spill out not just from social media and the kind of threats and horrible messages that a lot of people have received, but actually in public life, in public spaces.
Yeah.
And it's been going on for a very long time. And I think in that you just see how ridiculous it is to have people who claim to be the good guys, and yet they're carrying on like this. Even just the look of them tells you that they don't deserve that status, definitely.
Rakib, are they on the right side of history, do you think?
Oh, not in a million years. Not in a million years. I've been saying it for some time, and I've written about this for us at Spike. I've always been saying that the transgender movement is fundamentally misogynistic. There's very clear attempts to erase conventional understandings of womanhood, from a great deal of biological illiteracy there as well. And I think that what we saw, that the scenes in Bristol, comes as no surprise to me, that many of these male pro-trans zealots, they're fundamentally anti-women, and they're more than happy to be exceptionally aggressive towards women who are ultimately simply defending their rights in terms of safe spaces, sensitive safe spaces, where that might be public toilets. You're also talking about rape crisis centres, domestic violence sanctuaries. I also feel that the radical transgender movement, it could destroy women's sports. It really could. But I'm glad to see that there's a bit of a pushback, especially when it comes to the case of Emily Bridges. I believe that's the name in the cycling world. So I'm really glad to see now that there is a robust cultural pushback against this deeply authoritarian and anti-women movement.
Yeah, I mean, Tom, there is a bit of a pushback, but also it's strange how this movement has become kind of institutionalized so quickly. It's odd to see, kind of black-clad anarchists essentially arguing from the same hymn sheet as the Church of England, sections of the Conservative Party, every kind of establishment institution you can name, the BBC.
I think that's the problem in a way, is because in a sense, these people are a bit of a convenient foil. Even the kind of more mainstream organisations can say this is not what we're about. The issue is that the ideology, which seeks to basically erase the status of sex, full stop. I mean, any kind of sex-based distinctions, which is, as Rakib was saying, is so crucial to women's spaces, but also to sports, all kinds of things. It's also crucial to understanding reality as a concept. They want to erase this. And this is something which, and Joe Bartosz pointed this out in a piece for us this week about this particular protest, is that, the local council in Bristol is a Stonewall diversity champion, as I think is the local police service. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that meant they were a soft touch in this situation or anything like that, but the ideas that these outriders represent on a certain level have already been entirely accepted by the establishment. It's one of those ideologies that the more you try to push back at it, the more it seems to just creep through anyway. And I think that's one thing which is going to be the much bigger and knottier problem, is because of the fact that it has already become common sense and kind of enforced within a lot of these elite institutions. And that's going to take a very long time to unpick.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.